The year is 1564. On the banks of a wide, slow-moving river in what is now northeast Florida, a group of French Protestant settlers raises a fort of packed earth and timber. They call it Fort Caroline, in honor of King Charles IX. Within 2 years, it will be gone. Its people slaughtered, its buildings burned to the ground, and its exact location lost so thoroughly that 4 centuries of historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters still have not agreed on where it stood. This is not a story of a mystery invented for entertainment. It is a story of a real massacre, a real colony, and a real gap in the historical record that modern science still cannot close. Welcome to Grim State. This is the vanishing of Fort Caroline. To understand how a fortified colony of hundreds of people could simply disappear from the map, you have to understand the world that built it. In the 1560s, France was tearing itself apart. Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots, were locked in a series of religious wars that would eventually kill hundreds of thousands of people. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most powerful Huguenot leader in France, saw an opportunity in the New World. If French Protestants could establish a colony in North America, they would gain a foothold in territory the Spanish considered their own, open a base for privateering against Spanish treasure fleets, and create a place of refuge for Huguenots fleeing persecution at home. The first attempt came in 1562 when Jean Ribault led an expedition to the coast of what is now South Carolina and built a small outpost called Charlesfort. It failed within a year. Supplies ran low, the soldiers left behind grew desperate, and most of them eventually deserted and tried to sail back to France, a journey so catastrophic that survivors reportedly resorted to cannibalism before a passing English ship picked them up. Coligny did not give up. In 1564, he sent a second expedition, this time under the command of Renboulain de Laudonnerie, a French nobleman and experienced navigator who had sailed with Ribault 2 years earlier. Laudonnerie's ships reached the mouth of a river the French called the River of May, today the St. Johns River, near modern Jacksonville, Florida. There, on a bluff overlooking the water, they began construction of Fort Caroline. The fort was triangular, built largely of earth and timber in the French style, with a moat and defensive works on its landward side. Inside its walls, the French built a garrison, storehouses, and living quarters for what would eventually number several hundred settlers, soldiers, craftsmen, a few women, and even children. They made contact with the local Timucua people, particularly a powerful chief named Setuiwa, and for a time the two groups traded and coexisted, though French demands for food strained the relationship as supplies from home failed to arrive on schedule. This is where the historical record is strong. We have Laudonnerie's own written account of the colony's founding. We have the work of Jacques Lemoyne, an artist who traveled with the expedition and produced detailed illustrations of the fort, its construction, and Timucua life, illustrations that remain one of the only visual records of Native American life in the Southeast before European colonization erased so much of it. On paper, Fort Caroline should be one of the best documented early colonies in American history, and yet, within a year and a half, it will be wiped from existence so completely that we still cannot point to the ground where it stood. By the summer of 1565, Fort Caroline was starving. Laudonnerie's men had failed to plant enough crops, relations with the Timucua had soared over repeated demands for food, and morale had collapsed. Some soldiers mutinied. A group of colonists seized ships and turned to piracy against Spanish vessels in the Caribbean, an act that would have consequences no one at Fort Caroline could have predicted. Word reached the Spanish crown that French Protestants had built a permanent colony inside territory Spain claimed by right of the Treaty of Tordesillas and decades of prior exploration. To Spain, this was not simply a border dispute. It was heretics on Spanish soil threatening the annual treasure fleets that carried silver and gold from the Americas back to Europe. King Philip II decided the colony had to be destroyed. He sent Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, an experienced admiral and one of the most capable naval commanders in Spanish service. Menéndez's orders were explicit: eliminate the French presence in Florida by whatever means necessary. In August 1565, Menéndez landed roughly 40 miles south of Fort Caroline and founded a settlement he named St. Augustine, which would go on to become the oldest continuously occupied European established city in the continental United States. But St. Augustine was not the goal. It was the staging ground. Jean Ribault himself had just arrived at Fort Caroline with reinforcements and supplies from France, restoring some hope to the struggling colony. When Ribault learned that a Spanish fleet was operating nearby, he made a decision that would prove fatal. Rather than staying to defend the fort, he loaded most of the colony's able-bodied soldiers onto ships and set out to attack the Spanish directly at sea. A violent storm scattered and wrecked his fleet along the Florida coast, stranding hundreds of French soldiers, unarmed and exhausted. Far south of the fort they had left virtually undefended. Menéndez saw his opening. On September 20, 1565, in the pouring rain and under cover of darkness, Spanish forces marched overland and assaulted Fort Caroline. The garrison left behind was small, mostly the sick, the elderly, women, and children. The attack was over quickly. Contemporary accounts describe wholesale slaughter, most of the men killed outright, while roughly 50 women and children were taken prisoner rather than killed. Laudonnière himself escaped into the woods with a handful of survivors and eventually made it back to a ship anchored offshore. Sailing home to France to report what had happened, Menéndez renamed the captured Fort San Mateo and left a Spanish garrison in it. But his work was not finished. He still had to deal with Ribault's shipwrecked soldiers, stranded along the coast to the south. Over the following days, in two separate encounters near an inlet that still bears the name Matanzas, Spanish for slaughters, Menéndez accepted the surrender of hundreds of starving, unarmed French soldiers, then had nearly all of them executed. Contemporary Spanish accounts put the number killed at close to 350 men, including Ribault himself. A small number who claimed to be Catholic, along with some who agreed to convert or offered valuable skills, were spared. In the span of a few weeks, the French colonial project in Florida had been annihilated almost in its entirety. What had been a fortified settlement of hundreds of people was reduced to a captured shell renamed after a Spanish saint, and a stretch of beach that still, 500 years later, carries the name of a massacre. That much is documented, cross-referenced across French and Spanish sources, and accepted by historians. So where is the mystery? The mystery is not whether Fort Caroline existed or whether the massacre happened. The mystery is where precisely the fort itself stood. And it is a mystery that has consumed archaeologists for well over a century. The St. John's River has changed course since the 16th century. Its banks have eroded, its channels have shifted, and the coastline itself has moved due to centuries of sedimentation and human engineering, including the dredging of the modern shipping channel into Jacksonville. Laudonnière's own descriptions of the fort's location, along with Lemoyne's illustrations, give general clues: a bluff on the south bank of the river, a certain distance from the river's mouth. But 16th century measurements and coastal geography that has visibly transformed make pinpointing the site extraordinarily difficult. In the 1950s, the United States National Park Service, working with historians and the belief that they had identified the correct site, constructed a replica of Fort Caroline at what is now the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve along the St. Johns River. It remains a popular historical site today, drawing visitors who walk its reconstructed earthworks and imagine the events of 1565. But the uncomfortable truth acknowledged by the Park Service itself is that this is almost certainly not the actual site. Erosion is believed to have consumed the real location of the fort or shifted the riverbank so significantly that the true footprint may now lie underwater or beneath modern development that has never been excavated. For decades, archaeologists and amateur historians have proposed competing locations. Sites further upriver, sites closer to the coast, sites on the opposite bank, metal detector surveys, sediment core samples, and historical map overlays have all been employed in the search, with tantalizing finds along the way: French-style artifacts, period-appropriate ceramics, evidence of a European presence in the region during the correct time frame. But nothing has produced the kind of definitive, undisputed physical footprint, foundation lines, a moat, structural remains matching Lemoyne's illustrations that would let historians say with confidence, "This is it, this is where Fort Caroline stood." That absence matters more than it might seem. Fort Caroline is one of the earliest sustained European settlements in what would become the United States, predating the English colonies at Roanoke and Jamestown. Its destruction was arguably the first large-scale act of religious violence between European powers on North American soil, a preview of the centuries of colonial conflict to come. And its physical remains? The actual ground where hundreds of people lived, worked, and were ultimately killed may be gone, not hidden, not merely unexcavated, possibly erased by the same river that once served as the colony's lifeline. There is a further layer to this story that receives far less attention than the massacre itself, and it involves what happened to the survivors. Roughly 50 women and children were taken captive by Spanish forces at Fort Caroline rather than killed. Their fates are only partially recorded. Some were reportedly sent back to Spain or to Spanish colonial territories. Others may have remained in Spanish Florida, absorbed into a colonial society very different from the one their families had intended to build. The documentary record on these individuals, who they were, what became of them, whether any left descendants in the Americas, is thin, fragmented, and in places non-existent. In a story built around a religious and colonial conflict, fought largely by soldiers and commanders whose names we know in detail, the fate of these women and children remains one of the more genuine, unresolved threads in the historical record. There is also the matter of the Timucua people themselves, whose alliance with and eventual estrangement from the French shaped the colony's final year. Within roughly a century and a half of these events, the Timucua population had been devastated by European disease, conflict, and colonial disruption to the point of near extinction as a distinct culture. Jacques Lemoyne's illustrations remain, disturbingly, one of the most detailed surviving visual records of a people whose own voice and perspective on these events were never recorded in their own words. The war between France and Spain over a small fort on a Florida riverbank was for the Timucua the opening chapter of a demographic catastrophe that neither side intended and neither side prevented. In 2014, marking the 450th anniversary of Fort Caroline's founding, the effort to locate its true site saw renewed academic interest, with historians publicly reiterating that the accepted reconstruction is very likely built in the wrong place. Ground-penetrating radar surveys and updated GIS mapping using historical French and Spanish maps have narrowed the range of plausible locations, but as of today, no excavation has produced conclusive proof. It remains, quite literally, an American colonial site that we can describe in exhaustive documentary detail. Who built it, who destroyed it, how many died, what it was named, without being able to definitively say where it stood. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this story. We are used to historical mysteries involving disappearance, a lost colony like Roanoke, a vanished expedition, a ship that never made port. Fort Caroline is different. It did not vanish quietly or leave behind an unanswerable question about what happened to its people. We know precisely what happened. The mystery here is a mystery of ground truth, a place erased not by conspiracy or unexplained catastrophe, but by the ordinary, relentless work of a river changing its course over 450 years, swallowing the physical evidence of one of the earliest and bloodiest chapters of European colonization in North America. Somewhere along the banks of the St. Johns River, or beneath its current channel, or lost entirely to erosion and time, the true foundations of Fort Caroline may still exist, or they may not. Modern archaeology has the tools to search: sonar, radar, sediment analysis, historical cartography cross-referenced with satellite imagery. But the river has had a 4.5-century head start, and it does not give up its secrets easily, until the day someone digs into the right patch of ground and finds a moat that matches Jacques Lemoyne's 16th century sketches. The exact site of one of America's first colonies, and one of its first massacres, remains an open question, waiting in the mud of a Florida riverbank for someone to finally find it. If you want more stories like this, real history, real evidence, and the mysteries that still haven't been solved, subscribe to Grim State and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next.